Raymond, Singh, welcome to the podcast again.
Thank you, Matthew. It's good to be back.
Very glad to have you on again. And, I have some specific themes and ideas that I want to maybe explore. I don't know how many we'll get to, maybe all of them, maybe only a few, but I wanted to begin with kind of a simple question, which is it's simple, but I feel like maybe one of the most relevant questions to ask in a situation like this, which is there any specific idea or theme that's been on your mind more than others lately, either spiritually, philosophically, or socially?
As a preface, I was like thinking in my head, oh, I'm sure we can both find a way to make any simple idea into something complicated.
That's very true. That's very true.
But I was I was thinking a little bit because I've been going back and reading The Fold, Leibniz and the Baroque by Gilles Deleuze, which
Cool.
I'm very sad I stained the book with coffee inadvertently. But anyway,
Yeah.
In true like aleatoric spirit, I suppose. Just I see like sort of triads, like patterns of triads pop up a lot, not only in Deleuze and Guattari, but just in general. Like I feel like 3 is sort of a magic number, as De La Soul put it. And so just rhythms of 3s: creation, destruction, sustenance, like folding, unfolding, refolding, birth, death, and resurrection, and just the movement of sort of the triadic movement, but also with regards to like the idea of the Trinity, where like the sort of the beauty in the notion that that divinity or God is fundamentally relational and interwoven, and is sort of complicated in the sense of like overlapping folds, and sort of dynamic interplay between, or rather that the image of God in nature is has something to do with like spirit interplay, dynamism, relationality, and kind of bringing that back into like the notion of sort of threefold or like triadic entities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool. That's very cool. Yeah, I think about numbers a lot. 3 is one that I hold in high regard, as well as 7, and my favorite number is 17.
Right.
And one number that always like haunts me or something, or that it's a number that I've never immediately gravitated toward, but it's a number that like keeps popping up, which is 5. But I do want to touch on what you said about triads and stuff, because today, earlier, before, as I was thinking about our conversation, I was, I know that we've talked about symbols and archetypes and mythology before, and I've listened to some of your discussions with other folks about that a little bit. And so it's something that I'm super interested in, and I know you're interested in as well. And that's one of my questions. So maybe this will kind of just replace my original placement of that question, and we can talk about it now. But basically, when I was thinking about symbols and mythology, I was looking back at my manuscript for the book that I want to put out, From Infinity to Personhood. And in my chapter about non-duality, I brought up the Trinity, and I brought up even things like yin and yang and Shiva and Shakti, which are not a trinity, but they're also,
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
kind of this symbolic representation of like
Oh,
the different aspects of the divine or something, right?
yeah.
And so I wasn't going to explicitly bring it up, but I think, you know, I might as well in the context of triads.
Mhm.
um I wrote a couple paragraphs about the Christian Trinity and my own take on it, which, like with anything, especially symbols, is always somewhat playful and I hold it loosely. It's not, you know, I'm not like, this is the meaning of the, you know. But kind of one model of the Trinity that resonates with me is um, one of the Gnostic Gospels is called the Gospel of Truth, and
Mm.
there's one line from the Gospel of Truth, which, by the way, that's one of my favorite Gnostic Gospels. It's super cool. But there's a line that says that the Father is the root of the totality, and so that's kind of one interesting way to think about the Father. The Father is the
Yeah.
root of the totality. And then to me, the Son is a symbol for God in manifest form, you know, the
Yep.
logos become flesh,
Yeah.
the spirit become flesh, however you want to think about it, the Father become flesh or something,
Yeah.
infinity become finite or um
Yep.
so Father as root of the totality, Son as the divine become manifest. And you know, obviously most Christians or lots of Christian perspectives see that as exclusively in the form of Jesus.
Sure.
But to me, it's way beyond that. And it's literally any manifest form from, you know, a pine cone to my car key or something.
Yeah.
Like possibly. So, and then the spirit becomes a little harder to to pin down. I guess that makes sense, right? um
Sure.
but to me, I guess the most resonant way to think about that would be that the spirit would be the presence of the divine internally, you know. So like for us, that would, to me, that would be the kind of the surplus of love, inherent wisdom and intelligence, creativity, and what's the other one I'd lump into that? Yeah, surplus of love, creativity, and wisdom. We'll just stick with that.
Sure.
Um, yeah, so how do you feel about that?
I feel a lot of things about that. I was just like, oh man, this like sort of opening a bunch of doors simultaneously, which is a good thing. I guess spirit as surplus. There is, well, okay, I guess the first thing I'm just going to pick the first thing that's arising to my head, I suppose, which is that, you know, going back to this idea of, you know, triadic patterns, I'm thinking of like states of matter. Sort of, you know, if we just stick to the three basic ones
Yeah.
of solid, liquid, gas, it's like there's the liquidity of the Father, where it's like, you know, sort of deep water, deep ocean, sort of, you know, uh, almost identifying the formless void in the beginning of Genesis with the Father. So like the Spirit is hovering over the waters, the sort of kind of potentiality, primordial, I guess, if you want to steer into Whiteheadian terms. But then you have the liquid kind of further congealing and materializing. So like, you know, sort of an intensification of the state of matter,
Mm-hmm.
um, into the actual, which would be the sun, so that the sun being solid.
Mhm.
And then spirit as surplus, as breath, seems to be gaseous in the sense of like excited, heightened, just this bursting, very shifting form of materiality, or like molecularity. And I like the idea of spirit as connecting with gas, because it also kind of, I think you maybe touched on it being breath, but like the idea of like prana or pneuma. I think pneuma is the word that has the word for breath, and it's how the spirit is often translated, like in terms of Greek in the New Testament, if I'm not making
Mhm.
that,
Yeah, I
not
think
making
you're
that
right.
up. Okay, yeah. So like, but and so kind of like connecting the way that you've captured uh the relationship between Father, Son, and Spirit, which I love. Um, I feel like mapping that onto states of matter, it brings to mind that it's sort of the three in oneness. The sort of there's this sort of interchange and simultaneous expression of the same principle in three different forms that
Yep.
can also change into each other, um, and sort of overlap and become one another, and or in an almost monadic way. Uh, there is something of the Father and the Spirit in the Son. There's something of the Son and the Spirit in the Father.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Son is also liquid in the sense that it's like uh, the liquidity of transfiguration. Sort of being molded and becoming different shapes. Revolution, redemption. Cyclicality.
Yeah.
It's not solid in that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, just the I just, and I appreciate it also when you're talking about the Father as root. Um, that sense of like Father's root as like sort of fecund soil, or or something like a deep ocean. It's also like father mother. It's almost like it's kind of taking a step back in terms of the gendered language to like
Yep.
the notion of like being pregnant, like potentiality.
Yep.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I also wanted to say that like there's part of that image that um feels more ecological and less dominating.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I feel like the more Deleuze references I make, the more I become sort of a self caricature. But but as soon as you mention like the Father is like the root, I'm like, oh, rhizomes.
Mm.
In contrast to tree-like structures where it's sort of a
Mm.
top-down hierarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
there's something
Oh
about that.
God.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, that's so good. And honestly, I feel like you have more knowledge about um science essentially than I do. And so I really like when it seems like you can use really evocative analogies with well, just natural processes, as well as music too. I think that your love for music and your knowledge of music gives you that in your toolbox to kind of like compare things to in a really useful way. Um, but yeah, your point about the root in contrast to a more hierarchical structure, that's interesting. I guess before we get off of this topic, because yeah, I mean, we could talk about this topic the whole time.
Yeah.
But and that's cool too, but I guess I'm just curious, like, you know I don't know why I'm talking about Christianity so much.
No, let's go
uh
there. It's totally
but
fine. Yeah.
yeah, so when I think about the Spirit in terms of um what Jesus says in the biblical gospel, some of the things that he says about the Spirit. Number one, I think about the scene with Nicodemus, where Nicodemus goes to see him. He kind
Mm,
of sneaks off
little
essentially,
secret.
and
Yeah.
Yeah, and he goes to talk to him like in the middle of the night or whatever, and he's like, basically, how can I be born again? And then
Yep.
Jesus says you have to be born from spirit, and he compares spirit with water actually a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah, he
So
does.
that's interesting in relation to what you were saying about the different states of matter.
Hmm.
Thinking about spirit as water too. Um, but so I think about that scene, and I also think about that one quote where Jesus says something like, he's talking to his disciples and he says like, if you get persecuted, or if somebody confronts you for what you believe or how you're living, then don't worry about what you're going to say, because the spirit will kind of take care of it in a certain way. Like
Mm,
the spirit will give you the right words and the right way to handle the situation.
yeah.
And so I guess essentially I'm curious about, you know, if you can entertain the idea that spirit is some sort of surplus inside of you,
Yeah.
um do you feel like you have experienced that, or do experience that sense of having some sort of wellspring inside of you, that it's it's like, for me, even when I feel restricted or limited, or like feel a lack of some sort, I feel like I can kind of sometimes tap into a wellspring that allows me to transcend that lack, and it allows me to access, like I said, sometimes it feels more like love in a certain context. Sometimes it feels more like a intuition or wisdom, where I know something and I don't even know how I know it. And sometimes it's more creative, where, for example, like in my poetry, I can kind of surrender to that wellspring of fertile creativity inside me that doesn't seem to come from my conscious self or something.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about your own direct experience with the surplus.
Oh gosh. Um, that's such a big question. Um, yeah, I just need to kind of,
Yeah.
I'm trying to like stick to this whole idea of, like first thought, best thought, because
Hmm.
there's just so much richness that kind of comes
I know.
in what you bring in, just speaking of surplus. But I guess I think that what comes to mind when you're talking about the experience of surplus in that way is the relationship between creativity or the unconscious or imagination or spirit and and finiteness or the actual, right? That there is a tendency, let's say, that I can have. So I'll just speak to myself personally without getting
Yeah.
into like generalities. But to let's take the example of music, for example, for instance, like if there's a way in which, like, if I were to kind of turn down all the also like the self filtering, that it would
Hmm.
just be just streams of ideas. And that's not like, oh, I'm so creative. It's just,
Hmm.
if you get out of your own way and just create stuff without judging it,
Hmm.
it's like you remove the kink from the hose. It's just
Yep.
coming out.
Yep.
Um, and I think what the critique can do is it can add refinement and turns that sort of pure stream into a composition.
Yep.
Um, but it's also rational and analytic in the sense of ratio. Like it's dividing, it's deliberately kinking the fire hose in order to make something articulate.
Hmm.
But that can kind of be in an extreme sense or an unhealthy sense, it can be just like a real limitation. And so maybe
Yeah.
what I'm getting at is, and resonating with in terms of what you're saying, is that what is this sort of constant flow of creativity, that wellspring, which I really like that you put it that way.
Mhm.
And how often it is that when I'm trying to impose form or structure or some sense of articulation onto it,
Mhm.
um, for whatever reason, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing, but
Yeah.
that that's a process of limiting is what I guess what I'm getting at.
Mhm.
And instead of like trying to, it's you're operating within an environment of abundance as opposed to scarcity.
Exactly.
um and I think that another way of putting it is that you're operating in an environment of grace um as opposed to lack.
Yeah.
I remember you touching on briefly in a conversation we had, was that yesterday? No, yeah, yesterday, of the difference between universal fallenness versus, or
Mhm.
like original sin versus original blessing.
Yeah.
And I think that this idea of original blessing can kind of tie into this in terms of what is sort of this it's not lack. We're not operating from lack. There's no sort of God-sized hole in this way. That it's more that you can't go anywhere without finding God. Um,
Yeah.
it's the difference between, so like, gosh, so let's say indifference and repetition.
Mhm.
It's I know.
Hey,
it's
it's
the
cool.
it's the difference between like uh negation is like a negative number, and then difference, which is um everything is being, everything is what is, there's no escaping what is, and the only time
Mhm.
where negation or the negative comes is really as an expression of differentiality. Does that make sense? So like
Yeah.
there's no lack, it's just variation, expression, recreation, a shifting in the flow of the river.
Yeah.
um which is wonderful when you can kind of acknowledge that presence within yourself, but it's kind of hard because um I think the nature of co-creation,
Mhm.
um even if it's just you, um even if it's just me like being in my apartment creating music, the fact that there are neighbors around there, it's like I can't just be like creative fire hose that
Right.
so negotiating difference in the sense of limitation is also difficult. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It does. Yeah. I mean, I like what you said about the negative number thing and how it's um how yeah, it's like to identify difference doesn't mean that you're identifying lack. You're just
Right.
identifying distinction between, multiplicity or something.
Yeah.
And yeah, I feel that. And I think with creativity, kind of what you alluded to about editing and stuff, I mean, the full range of the creative act is I guess to me the ideal expression of that would be some level of like letting the fire hose just blast water mixed with um like you said, kind of finding ways to contain it or articulate it so that it's not just complete chaos.
Yeah.
And one irony with that is like a lot of times, even if you set out to completely just let whatever come when it comes to like language or music or visual art or whatever, um often even the most spontaneous, even seemingly utter spontaneity has patterns to it,
Yeah.
like which that's one thing that's just so fascinating to me. And it's also kind of like comforting in the sense that I know when I surrender to kind of utter spontaneous expression when it comes to creativity, patterns still emerge. It's not
Hmm.
completely incoherent.
Yeah.
So that's kind of cool in itself.
That's how that's how that's how you know organic life kind of has come about as well, in some sense, that like you have it's the whole idea of like having eddies and whirlpools in the river, that just uh chaos is never pure chaos, in the sense that
Right.
there's this, again, going back to like ideas of fecundity or pregnancy, like there's order in there somewhere, the potential for order in there, and order is this emergent phenomenon out of chaos.
Right.
Like local stabilities, uh, and I guess you were talking about like the relationship between sort of free flow of
Mm-hmm.
expression, or like free flow of inspiration, like
Mm-hmm.
inspiration, spirit, breath, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
um I know this was something that we had talked about a little bit ago, but like my relationship with the album Spirit of Eden by Talk Talk, um you know and I guess the whole idea of Eden also connects to this notion of a wellspring. um but the process that I think Mark Hollis and company had undertaken in order to make that album, and the one after, Laughing Stock, was kind of this idea where you you want to, they're trying to get as close to like spontaneous action as they could,
Right.
um to like try to capture that magic of like the first take, where like
Mm-hmm.
you know if I guess, how much drafting do you do with your poetry? Because there can kind of, I feel like there can kind of be this, if you're doing like multiple takes of a solo or a song or whatever, you're like,
Mm-hmm.
there's something about that first, like the first couple times you do it, where there's this like alchemical spirit that can kind of get lost the more you try to get it right.
Oh yeah.
um
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I want to actually, well, with my poetry, sometimes less editing is required and sometimes more editing is required. And there was a time when I was going to school for poetry where I think I got too obsessed with editing. Actually, like I would just edit the poem down to down to bare bones, and I would suck a lot of the life out of it. And so um there's kind of like, you can go too far in either direction, I
yeah.
think. And so, but mentioning that album, Spirit of Eden, I remember reading about the process of making that album.
It's
And
fascinating.
can you say anything more about, like, because I know that there was a, like, what did the editing process look like for that album? Do you
If
know?
I Yeah, if I remember correctly, so that was like that's the other half of this, right? Because it wasn't just sort of like again, it wasn't sort of pure fire hose or whatever.
Right.
That painstakingly, and like this is before it, DAWs and just like the ease in which you can kind of cobble things together. Um, running through recordings, like little snippets of just session musicians or the band like improvising over like a given chart or whatever, and then arranging you know a song out of just like hours and hours and hours and hours of improvisational material,
Right.
um to like which is just absolutely wild to me. And I get why, like that you can you just like there were there's a feeling of being like pushed to like the creative breaking point in that construction, because there are these weird, like, part of why I love that album and Laughing Stock is just the way it's just sort of like perfused with like spirituality and like a mystery. Like there you know, the way it can kind of surprise you with like a violin part, or this sort of, you know, atonal section that just kind of comes out of nowhere, and like there's no way to like construct that sort of in, you know, in the moment. It's almost, it's really just like, oh, you know, there's the magic of kind of sense making is also part of, is also sort of an important part of the creative process, I guess, what I'm trying to say.
Mhm.
But yeah, in the same way, I feel like a lot of movies, they, you know, this sort of the cliche of like movies are made in the editing room. That was very much the case for the construction of that album as well. Yeah.
Right, right. And the material that they were working with was kind of more of the spontaneous
Right.
improvisation. And so that was the working material that they then took to the editing room and then carved
Yeah.
such a beautiful album out of. So
Yeah.
um yeah, well, you know, you mentioned organism a little while ago, and that was the second big thing I wanted to bring up. And it relates to a lot of the stuff we've been saying, but if there's something that we haven't touched on in this regard, I'd like to hear you talk about how kind of how do you think understanding organism and understanding how organisms unfold and operate, how do you think that is useful? How can that help? How can that understanding help us individually and collectively, do you think?
I think the first thing that kind of comes to mind is how it relates to like the notion of selfhood or identity. Um, an organism is sort of a local node of interaction, and that's that is sort of, you know, an organism is an organism and its environment, or an organism in relation to its environment. It's an
Right.
ecological entity, right? And, you know, with it, an organism is an organization.
Mhm.
Um, and so how it is without is the same way as it is within.
Mm,
So there's sort of an affirmation of, again, like cooperation, multiplicity, exchange,
mhm,
interdependence.
mhm,
Um, and so interdependence, I guess, so like you know, an ecological mindset. And the other part of that is mutability, that what an organism is, or what its nature is, it's something that's sort of unfolding with time. Um, it's, you know, it's a single cell until it's a multiple cell, and then it's a multiple cell until it's like a particular, you know, a multiplicity of, you know, like a particular arrangement. And again, like you can use a musical analogy for that as well. And so when you're talking about mutability and interdependence, or like process and relationality, right? Uh, how that reflects on a competing notion of selfhood and identity as something static and isolated, it kind of falls apart. And I think that, you know, you're talking about the impact or the implications of organism individually and collectively. Like, well, how deep does the enemy of that comes from, like, you know, considering yourself as like this isolated static thing, um burrow itself into so many facets of how we live and exist in the world and with each other and with respect to nature.
yep.
It's pretty, I feel like that, just understanding that is, it can have a profound impact. I'm not saying it's sort of inherently profound, but
Right. Right.
uh it's certainly it certainly kind of flies in the face of a lot of, I feel like, underlying or operating assumptions that we can make about who we are. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's, well, I mean, that relates to the collective too, but maybe you
Mhm.
could touch on that in a second, even more if you have any points about it. But yeah, that's I definitely resonate with that. And I mean, it reminds me of Buddhism in a lot of ways, right? I mean, interdependence is a
Dependent
huge part
arising.
of Buddhism.
Yeah.
Yeah, dependent origination, stuff like that, and self in process. There is no static stable self.
Hmm.
The self is always in relationship to the multiple interdependent factors that allow that self to arise in the first place. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I like that, the your emphasis on both interdependence and wait, what is mutability? So it's
Yeah.
like constantly in process, and
Yeah.
it's impossible for it to not be in relationship to its environment.
Yeah.
And so that re-envisioning of personhood could really, I mean, it has, when it's practiced and when it's acknowledged, it
Yeah.
has, and it can have a very deep impact on our sense of identity, and how we relate to our environments, how we relate to other people. So is there anything else about how, I mean, all of this is tied together, but
Hmm.
like collectively, um how kind of a looking at the world through the lens of organism, how that can kind of help us collectively. Do you have anything else to say about that?
Gosh. It yeah, I think, well, identities can be sort of individual identities. That there could be like group identity as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose that it's harder, it can be harder to sort of dehumanize or marginalize, I think, um, certain groups of people
Mm-hmm.
when interdependence is affirmed more,
Yeah.
because at that point there is this, like, the static self becomes like this dipole between self and other,
Right.
where the affirmation of the other is like necessary for the health of the ecosystem, like the social ecosystem and all the organisms within it, because the organisms are part of a system. And it's a system health that kind of flows back to the health of the individual or the groups or whatever.
Yeah.
So I suppose that's part of it. And then with regards to the mutability, um, I kind of wonder how that relates to patriotism, jingoism,
Mm-hmm.
exceptionalism.
Mm-hmm.
That you're not this, like, for example, like America isn't this sort of static entity with,
Exactly.
we are this and we've always been this and we're going to be this forever. That there's a there's a mature sort of freedom in acknowledging yourself, and this is yourself as like collectively, as a process,
Yeah.
um, that is both humble and honest and also redemptive in a way, because you're able to kind of, I think, like Matt Siegel had used the something about the um, something in conversation about like the wreckage of history,
Mm.
um, and I think that mutability at the collective level, and like sort of like encouraging mutability, the notion of
Yeah.
mutability at a collective level, is a redemptive act because it allows you to work with and acknowledge the wreckage of history, as opposed to just sort of burying it and shoving it in a time capsule and like burying it underground. Um, yeah. So
I like that.
just the humanity, like, yeah, to acknowledge to acknowledge like the play of organism at every level of nature is sort of is to acknowledge humanity at the human level.
Yeah.
um I think, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Healthy embrace of flexibility is important, collectively and individually. I like what you said about when it comes to like nationalism and stuff like that, and any sort of group identity. I think that mutability is probably a useful thing to keep in mind. Um, you know, one thing that came to mind when you were talking was like, when it comes to like on an individual level, I think it's really easy for us to have like kind of a static narrative about ourselves. We're like, okay, this is who I am, this is the way I see the world, this is the way I see myself, this is the way I operate in the world, these are my tendencies, these are my patterns. And of course, like so many of our patterns are very deeply ingrained, and it's hard to transform them. And but nevertheless, I think that those stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves can hinder us from really taking advantage of the potential mutability of our own selves. And
Yeah.
so it's like, being able to have enough spaciousness within us to, that's the way I think about it, like a certain amount of spaciousness
Hmm.
that allows us to like dislodge ourselves from kind of just like automatic karma. I think about
Mm.
it in terms of karma, like in the sense of, I think about like karmic momentum. It's like there's so much karmic momentum within each one of us that usually results in just kind of these automatic patterns and stuff,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but I think cultivating a certain amount of spaciousness and also an acknowledgement of what we were saying about interdependence, mutability, process, all of those things can help us not just kind of blindly um, get carried away by the automatic karmic momentum individually and collectively.
Yeah, karmic momentum, I really like that phrase. It The way it, I guess the image that was coming to my mind as you were expanding upon that idea
Hmm.
was, we've been kind of like using a lot of like water imagery maybe
Yeah.
so far, and it's the idea of karmic momentum as being sort of like stuck in a particular tributary, like um or I think of like, how how, like, I think when William James was talking about habit, like it's like this like notion of like carving out, you know uh a particular way of how the flow of your mind goes, and and so that made me think of, habit as like a habitus, like a way of dwelling that
Ooh,
feels
yeah.
more like stationary.
Yeah.
um and the relationship between habit on the one hand and territory on the other.
Mm.
um and it's almost like, to go back to what we were talking about with regards to the Trinity, like you're only affirming one person of the Trinity. Like it's like, oh, no, no, we only want solidity.
Right.
And to really sort of fully express the the divinity that sort of like sort of running through everything, through you, through countries even. Not in a theocratic sense, of course, but just, this expression of like that divine balance between chaos and order, that you need sort of solidity and liquidity and sort of like this like more vapor cloud like phenomenon to maintain health. Like it's the difference between, I don't know, like a if you have like, pure anarchy or like just pure market economy on the one side, and then like just totalitarian planned economy on the other side. There needs to be some way of constant navigation, because it's hard to find anything that's truly truly static and isolated in the world if you can, like. And so if I feel like if you are really fixated on solidity or stasis, what you're really doing is setting yourself up for failure by repressing the natural movement of the river.
Exactly.
And it's a failure to adapt in like in sort of like the prosaic, like evolutionary like survival way of thinking about this. Like it's just you need a bit of suppleness. Like what you were saying really reminded me of Emerson, like that emphasis on, keep yourself a little bit loose. Like don't kind of fall into this like crevice of dogma. And
calcification,
exactly. Yeah, because like there's it's thinking about the collective level, it's the difference between like I feel like something about totalitarianism is very fixated on like things lasting forever. I think of like the 1,000-Year Reich, or like sort of the revolution to end all revolutions. Right, there's something about like, okay, we're gonna change everything, and now like everyone just like stop, like just stop what you're doing. Don't move around. We're gonna do this forever. And in order to do that, obviously, because of the way things sort of unfold and like fall apart constantly, you just need to impose more and more order, requiring more and more energy, and then things naturally become this like monster, that even if people went into it with good intentions, it's just like that's what's required to maintain stasis at that level. So it's the difference between repression and like sort of repression, negation, reductiveness of divine flow on the one side, and like the need for revolution and the need for transfiguration, at least a little bit, to kind of constantly keep moving, or honor the movement that's happening regardless of whether you want it to or not.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of Taoism in a lot of ways. That's one thing I love about Taoism, is that it really highlights that, I mean, both the yin and the yang, right? As corny as that has come to sound. But it's like that the natural movement that and even there's a book called The Tao of Politics that talks about that in the realm of politics and social systems, and it really talks about how the wisest social systems are going to be the ones that do adapt to the ongoing fluctuations that are happening, instead of the ones that would try to freeze themselves, like you were saying. And so I just wanted to bring that in there. I can't believe so much time has already gone by, literally almost an hour. So I'm thinking I'm going to ask one more question, and we can see how this one goes. And now it's hard for me to choose from the ones I have here.
Pick your favorite number.
Yeah, right. Because
17th question.
Basically, I have, well, I have, if I want to shave it down, I kind of have two main themes that I'm going to choose from. So
Okay.
either intentionality or imagination. Um, which one would you be more excited to talk about?
I feel like because we kind of like we kind of
Yeah,
touched on imagination a bit
yeah, yeah,
with the sort of the creativity spirit thing, so we can go the
right.
other direction. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I actually pulled a quote from the paper that you sent me.
Oh boy.
So for the listeners, Raymond sent me a paper, a final paper that he wrote for one of his classes that he's taking at CIIS. Um, and it was, it was an excellent paper, and there were certain parts of it that hit me pretty hard. And so this quote is from that paper, if you don't mind me reading it, Raymond.
I let's go ahead.
Okay,
I'll
cool.
deal with it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it says, the world of daily life, the world of survival, continues to mutate. A religious paradigm that does not adapt. This is totally related to what we were just
Yeah,
talking about.
yeah, it really is.
A religious paradigm that does not adapt as a resistance to these mutations will only serve to feed it, confusing the horizon for the shore. So that's very interesting to me in the context of like a religious paradigm, right? So
Mhm.
and we've talked about this recently a little bit too,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering, in your view, like when you said a religious paradigm that does not adapt as a resistance to these mutations, um like how do you think a religious paradigm can continually adapt while at the same time preserving something that keeps it together as a specific paradigm, if that makes sense? Like, how do we negotiate or navigate preservation with constant adaptation, if that makes sense?
Yeah. That's the question.
Yeah,
Um I guess the thing I was thinking about was like the use of
yeah,
symbol and ritual, and the relationship that people have to symbol and ritual, and also community, right? Like where there's a way of, well, yeah, it kind of relates to what we were talking about. I think there's a way in which you can calcify or deaden symbols, rituals, and a community by saying like, okay, this is our fixed identity of like this interpretation, this meaning, like this is what it means forever and eternity. Like just, or I mean, for lack of a better word, like
yeah,
just fundamentalism, right?
yeah.
Um, and I, and I think implicit in this answer, in this discussion, is like an acknowledgement that um there's no sort of like um set of like fine tuning constants that that were like, okay, if you just you know keep it to this percentage of like deconstruction,
Yeah.
that this is what's like a healthy thing.
Right.
But there's but I think that there's a power in symbol and ritual and community to, or symbol specifically, to kind of like bring together the past and the future,
Mm-hmm.
um in a sort of like dynamic moving point. It's almost like uh again, going back to the river metaphor, right? There is, or like, let's put it this way. So um there's a way in describing or capturing the behavior of a fluid flow where you abstract a part of the flow and by describing the like the velocity or whatever of the fluid flow at this particular like sort of abstract volume, you
Mm-hmm.
capture what the whole thing is doing.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing within that container is changing its properties all the time. And I think
Mm-hmm.
symbols function in a similar way,
Hmm.
where it's this container that you're abstracting from reality of like, this is a particular pattern or a particular way that reality is that we can see as being like instantiated again and again and again.
Yeah.
And it relates the past of the flow to the future of the flow. But what's within the container, like the particularities of the container, are mobile. They can change over time. And that keeps them sort of, again, sort of supple and alive and like sort of capturing the truth of what you're trying to model.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the balance of sort of conservation with progressivism lies
Mm-hmm.
in the ability to engage in the work of like symbolic interpretation and symbolic transformation.
Yep.
That it's you're bringing in all of your prejudice. This is Gadamer, which I also referenced in that paper. Like bringing in your prejudices, bringing in where you're coming from, and sort of meeting in this place of symbol of community, and then going apart and bringing it again and going apart. Because every time that you come to meet, you're bringing in not only the past but also the world that you're living in. Does that make sense? So it's
It does.
it's sort of a space for the world to kind of keep coming into your religious paradigm, as opposed to if you lock your definition in dogma, you're not
Yeah.
like whatever happens in the world, it's not being brought in to provide fertile soil for reinterpretation of the symbol, and then you're not relating to the world at all. You become sort
Right.
of closed off. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. Yeah. So it seems like, we can carry specific symbols from the past with us, and so we can preserve or conserve those. But they are living symbols in the sense that our interpretations of the symbols continue to expand, and and so our interpretations of the symbols continue to expand based on our own experience and our own growth, as well as the different unfoldings of reality and nature. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
the world continues to change, nature continues to change, and so we readjust our interpretations of a specific symbol system based on the ongoing changes that occur. And it also reminds me of like a scene from Catcher in the Rye, J.D. Salinger, where Holden Caulfield goes into a museum that he used to go into as a kid, or I mean, he's still a kid basically, but when he was a younger kid. And he says that like the displays had not changed at all, but he had changed, so his
Yeah.
whole experience of those displays changed because he had changed. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a cool way to look at it,
Yeah.
that
And
symbols can be preserved in a healthy way, as long as we are, supple enough and flexible enough to continue to kind of reimagine our relationship with those symbols and reinterpret them in new ways,
yeah, yeah, reimagining. So we kind of like still snuck in the imagination in this conversation.
Yeah.
But yeah, like just sort of if you want to kind of bring it back to what we were talking about before, that like
Yeah.
um when we're talking about living symbols, we're talking about breathing in new life into this sort of containers. And so it's
Yep.
we think about go all the way back to like the Genesis story of God breathing into Adam and that's the breath of life, that like you need this continual like sort of like practice of re-inspiration as a
Yes.
sort of like um you know uh like vivifying and like it's like a participatory engagement with the thing that's
Yes.
already happening, like in the
Yeah.
same way that we were talking about like nation states or individuals or whatever.
Right.
It's all
Yeah.
in a, I'm not sure if I'm just like projecting or
No,
like
no,
it all
it's
seems to
kind
be
of,
kind of like the same movement, you know.
yeah, it's kind of amazing how everything we brought up today really threads together and kind of a central theme, it seems.
Yeah.
Which again, it kind of relates. I mean, speaking of things relating, but like that whole thing I said about even when you kind of just go into something with the intention of being spontaneous, there's still patterns that emerge. You can't really get away
Yes.
from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's just, I think in true sort of like in true sort of jazz improvisation,
Yeah.
the spirit of that like you get, there's a certain like practice of noticing and like attention, where you're like, oh, okay, there's, I like that motif, like let's like
Yeah,
sort of bring that back, or like I like
that's
that
right.
piece, I'm going to bring that back, and
That's right.
and then again, like sort of from the sort of like the chaotic flow of things, order just emerges because it can't, there's a way in which it kind of can't help itself to do that if the
Yeah,
conditions are right. Yeah,
exactly. Well, this has been fantastic. I truly enjoyed
it's
it.
a lot of fun, of
And
course. Yeah,
yeah, it was really good. And to be honest with you, that was like it went by so fast. It
it
went by
went by
so
really
so fast.
fast.
Like faster
Yeah, yeah,
than
yeah.
like any podcast I've ever had probably. So that's a good sign though. And we'll do more of these and
Yeah,
we'll keep
absolutely.
this conversation ongoing. So thank you so
Definitely.
much, Raymond. Till next time.
Yeah,
Peace.
thanks, Matthew.
See ya.